A recruit laughed as she wrapped a bandage around his arm. "If this base ever got attacked, you'd be the first person running," he said, loud enough for the whole tent to hear. She didn't answer. Minutes later, an armed man walked onto that base with a gun pressed to a recruit's head, and the woman everyone called just the nurse ended the standoff in 3 seconds flat, using nothing but a first aid kit and her bare hands. But that wasn't even the strangest part of that day. By nightfall, a black SUV rolled through the front gate, and the 2 men who stepped out of it weren't there for the intruder at all. They were there for her. Camp Harrison sat at the edge of a dry training range in the high desert, the kind of installation that existed mostly to turn 18-year-olds into soldiers over the course of a brutal 8 weeks. The medical tent stood off to one side of the main yard, unremarkable canvas among rows of identical canvas, visited by recruits only for the small injuries that came with obstacle courses and careless bootlaces. Dana Reyes ran that tent alone. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, quiet in the specific way that made people forget she was in the room, wearing a faded medical smock over plain fatigues, her dark hair pulled back without ceremony. She kept her first aid kit organized with a precision that suggested either deep professional habit or something considerably more particular, and she rarely spoke beyond what a given task required. The recruit currently sitting on her exam table was named Dax Calloway, 19, built like someone who'd spent his adolescence lifting weights specifically so people would notice, and he flexed his freshly bandaged forearm like he was testing whether her work would hold up under scrutiny. "You sure you didn't miss a spot?" he said, smirking toward the tent entrance where 2 other recruits stood watching. Dana didn't look up from restocking her supply tray. "It'll hold. If this base ever got attacked," Dax said, raising his voice for the benefit of his audience, "you'd be the first person running. Straight out that flap, kit and all." The 2 recruits at the entrance laughed, the easy laugh of young men who had never once had their confidence seriously tested by anything more dangerous than a physical training test. Dana set the last roll of gauze into its slot. She didn't respond. She'd stopped responding to comments like this a long time ago, filing them under the enormous category of things that weren't worth the breath it would take to correct. Sergeant Kane, a barrel-chested man with a permanent scowl who ran the recruits' morning drills, appeared in the tent doorway a moment later, drawn by the laughter. He glanced at Dax's bandaged arm, then at Dana, and allowed himself a small, dismissive smile of his own. "She might put you in a sling for that attitude someday," Kane said, though his tone made clear he considered it an entirely empty threat. Dana handed Dax a small packet of painkillers. "Keep it dry. Come back if it swells." Dax rolled his eyes and sauntered out past Kane, muttering something that dissolved into the general noise of the yard. Kane lingered a moment longer, studying Dana with the specific curiosity of a man who had worked alongside someone for 2 years without ever quite deciding what he thought of her, and then he left too. Dana sat alone in the sudden quiet, the tent's single generator humming outside. She reached into a side pocket of her kit and drew out a small, worn photograph, herself, younger, standing beside a man in desert camouflage, both of them squinting against harsh sunlight. She looked at it for a long moment, thumb brushing lightly across the surface, then slid it back into its pocket without any change in her expression. If a story like this one already has your attention, stay with us, because what happens to Dana Reyes over the next several hours is something this entire base will still be talking about years from now. The following afternoon brought harder edges to the same routine. Dana was crossing the training yard with a crate of restocked supplies when a taller recruit named Jory Mason, gold chain visible at his collar despite regulation, cut across her path with 2 friends trailing behind him. "Yo, camp nurse," Mason called out. "You gonna bandage the enemy to death if it comes to it?" "She's probably scared of her own shadow," one of his friends added, and the group laughed together, loose and careless. Dana kept walking, grip steady on the crate. Mason jogged a few steps to catch up, positioning himself directly in her path. "I'm talking to you," he said. "What's even the deal with that uniform? Looks like it came from a thrift store." The laughter swelled behind him. Dana reached her tent without responding, set the crate down, and began unpacking supplies with the same unreadable calm she carried through every version of this conversation. That evening, a recruit named Priya Voss leaned against the tent flap, arms crossed, watching Dana work. "You're wasting space here," Priya said. This whole setup. Somebody who actually wants to be a medic should have this tent. Dana glanced up, held her gaze for a moment, said nothing, and went back to organizing her supply shelf. It was well past midnight during a routine inventory check, the base quiet except for the distant hum of a patrol vehicle circling the perimeter road, when Dana found something that didn't belong tucked inside a box of gauze rolls. A folded piece of paper, creased and slightly yellowed at the edges, a single line of handwriting in black ink. Shadow Wolf lives. Her fingers went still on the page. For one full second, her breath caught somewhere in her chest before she folded the note carefully back along its original creases and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She glanced around the empty tent. Nothing. Just canvas walls and the low mechanical hum of the generator. The note wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Someone on this base knew who she'd been before the medical smock, before the quiet, before 9 years of practicing invisibility so thoroughly that even she had started to believe in it most days. She sat with that knowledge for a long while, hands resting on her knees, eyes drifting once to the faded, barely legible insignia stitched into the shoulder of an old jacket folded at the bottom of her footlocker. She didn't destroy the note. She didn't report it. She simply sat with the specific, familiar weight of a past she'd worked very hard to leave buried, and understood, somewhere in that stillness, that it had just started digging its own way back to the surface regardless of what she wanted. Subscribe. Actually, forget the formalities. Just stay with us. Because what happens the following afternoon is the reason nobody at Camp Harrison has laughed at a quiet person again. Thursday afternoon brought the alarm. It cut across the training yard in a long, ugly wail, followed almost immediately by shouting near the main gate. A man in a dark civilian jacket had breached the perimeter fence during a maintenance gap in the patrol schedule, moving fast across open ground before anyone organized enough to intercept him. By the time Sergeant Kane reached the yard, the intruder already had recruit Ellis Cho by the collar, a handgun pressed hard against the side of the boy's head. "Everybody stays exactly where they are," the intruder shouted, voice cracking with the specific unstable energy of someone who hadn't fully planned past this exact moment. "Nobody move." Recruits froze across the yard, faces draining pale. Kane shouted orders that came out half-formed, his own hand hovering uselessly near a sidearm he knew better than to draw at this range with a hostage in the mix. Dana stepped out of her tent at the sound of the alarm, medical kit already in hand out of 9 years of reflex, and started walking toward the commotion at a pace that read, to everyone watching, as either suicidal or completely detached from the danger in front of her. "Ma'am, get back," Kane barked at her. Dana didn't slow down. The intruder's eyes found her as she crossed into the open ground between the barracks, and something in her calm, unhurried approach seemed to strike him as an insult worth addressing directly. "This nurse thinks she's a hero," he sneered, jerking the gun slightly for emphasis, though he kept it trained on Ellis. "What are you going to do? Save the world with a first aid kit?" "Let him go," Dana said. Her voice carried across the yard without needing to be raised, flat and entirely without fear. The intruder laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what?" Dana took another step, then another. The distance between them collapsed to something measured in feet rather than yards, and the intruder, distracted by his own performance of control, didn't fully register how close she'd actually gotten until it no longer mattered. What happened next took 11 seconds, though nobody watching would have been able to count them accurately in the moment. Dana's medical kit came up and across in a single motion, the reinforced corner of the case connecting with the intruder's wrist hard enough to send the handgun spinning out of his grip before his brain had processed that his hand was empty. She was already moving through the opening that created, pivoting inside his guard, her forearm locking across his throat from behind while her legs swept both of his out from under him in the same continuous motion. He hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs in one sharp exhale. Dana had his wrist zip-tied with a length of medical tubing before he finished registering that he was on the ground at all, her knee pinning his shoulder, her other hand already checking Ellis for injury with the same clinical efficiency she brought to a skinned knee. The training yard had gone completely silent. Ellis stood frozen a few feet away, hands shaking, staring at Dana like he was trying to reconcile the woman who'd bandaged his blistered heel 2 weeks earlier with whatever he'd just watched happen in under 15 seconds. What, he managed. What just happened? Kane approached slowly, his own hand still resting on his unfired sidearm, looking at Dana with an expression that had nothing to do with the intruder now zip-tied and groaning on the gravel. "That's not the skill of a regular nurse," he said, quiet enough that only Dana heard it clearly. Dana stood, brushed dust from her knees, and her face returned to the same unreadable calm it carried through every ordinary Tuesday. She peeled off the single glove she'd had time to put on, dropped it into her kit, and addressed the yard in the same flat, professional tone she used for everything. "Someone secure him properly. And give me a stretcher for Ellis. He needs to sit down before he goes into shock." If this story has you leaning forward right now, this is a good moment to send it to someone who needs a reminder that the quietest people in a room are sometimes the ones actually holding it together. Base security arrived within minutes, boots pounding gravel, led by a broad man with a buzz cut whose name tape read Ferris. He demanded Dana's identification before anything else, the specific instinct of someone trained to establish control of a scene by establishing control of everyone standing in it. Dana handed it over without a word. Ferris fed the card into his handheld scanner. The screen took a moment longer than usual to respond, then flashed red. "Access restricted, level black, clearance required." Ferris looked up at her, his professional composure cracking slightly at the edges. "Level black isn't issued to base medical personnel," he said. "This isn't a valid classification for your position." "No," Dana agreed. "It isn't." "Then why does your ID carry it?" Dana didn't answer that. She knelt back down beside Ellis instead, checking his pulse with steady, practiced fingers, telling him to breathe slow and even, ignoring the question entirely in a way that somehow answered it more completely than any explanation could have. Medics arrived a few minutes later to take the intruder into custody, and one of them, an older paramedic named Sully who'd worked base emergencies for nearly 2 decades, paused beside Dana as his colleagues loaded the zip-tied man onto a gurney. He'd watched the entire 11 seconds from the mess hall doorway, close enough to see clearly, far enough to still doubt what he'd seen. "I've patched up men who came back from real combat zones," Sully said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I've seen what that kind of training does to how a person moves. I saw it just now, in you, and I don't think you've ever set foot in a combat zone according to any paperwork this base has on file." "Paperwork isn't always where a person's whole story lives," Dana said. Sully looked at her a moment longer, then nodded slowly, the specific nod of a man deciding not to ask a second question when the first one had already told him more than he was probably supposed to know. He returned to his colleagues without another word, and Dana watched the gurney wheel away across the gravel, the intruder still groaning, already forgotten by a yard that had far more urgent things to whisper about than the man who'd started the entire afternoon. The whispers started before Ferris had even finished writing his incident report. By dinner, the entire base had assembled some version of the story, most of it wrong in the specifics and entirely correct in the general shape of it. The quiet nurse everyone had spent 2 years overlooking had just taken down an armed intruder in the time it takes to boil water, using a medical kit and her bare hands. And her identification carried a clearance level nobody at Camp Harrison had ever personally encountered. Mason sat in the mess hall that evening with his usual crew, all of them unusually quiet, their trays largely untouched. "Who is she?" muttered a recruit named Dawson, acne-scarred and visibly rattled. "Don't tell me she's actually special forces or something." Mason didn't answer. He stared at his tray, gold chain tucked carefully under his collar, looking considerably smaller than he had the previous afternoon. The black SUV arrived the following morning, rolling through the front gate with the specific, unhurried authority of people who had never needed to announce themselves to be taken seriously. 2 men stepped out. The one in front was tall, silver-haired, a chest full of service ribbons visible beneath a plain civilian jacket he wore like it still fit uncomfortably over a uniform he'd spent 30 years in. He walked directly toward Dana's tent without asking anyone for directions. He stopped in the tent's entrance and came to full attention, a crisp salute that made every nearby recruit's mouth fall open in confused unison. "Commander Mitchell," he said. The name landed across the yard like something physical. Recruits who'd been pretending not to watch stopped pretending entirely. Dana looked up slowly from the supplies she'd been organizing. "General Halvorsen," she said, quiet and even. "I was told you were dead," Halvorsen said. 11 years ago, I stood at a memorial service with your name on a folded flag I wasn't allowed to give to anyone, because there was no family left to give it to, and no official record that would have let me explain who I was actually mourning." "I know," Dana said. "I read the obituary. It was accurate about most things." "Why here?" Halvorsen asked. "Why a medical tent at a basic training camp in the middle of nowhere?" Dana considered the question the way she considered most things now, slowly, weighing exactly how much of an answer the moment actually deserved. "Because after Shadow Wolf ended the way it ended, I didn't know how to be anyone except the version of myself that patches people up and doesn't ask questions about what they did before they walked into my tent. This seemed like the closest thing to that I could still legally do." A lieutenant named Burke, who had followed Halvorsen partway across the yard out of curiosity he couldn't quite suppress, spoke up from a few feet back. "If she's such a big deal," he said, loud enough to carry, "why she been hiding in a nurse's uniform for 2 years? Sounds like someone who ran from something." Dana's eyes found him. "I didn't run," she said, and something in the flat certainty of it made Burke's posture falter visibly, his earlier confidence draining out of him in real time. Halvorsen extended a manila folder toward her. "Orders from the Defense Department," he said. "Reinstatement of Shadow Wolf Command Authority. Effective immediately, pending your acceptance." Dana took the folder, opened it, scanned the single page inside without any change in her expression, and closed it again. "All right," she said. Halvorsen studied her for a moment longer, something that might have been relief crossing his weathered face. "There's a briefing in 6 hours," he said. "A situation that needs someone with your specific background, somewhere I'm not authorized to discuss in the open air of a training yard." "I understand." He saluted again, turned, and walked back toward the waiting SUV, boots kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the morning light behind him. By that afternoon, the consequences had already begun settling across the base with the specific quiet efficiency of an institution correcting itself. Mason found himself stripped of his informal leadership role among the recruits and assigned 2 weeks of latrine duty, a punishment nobody had to explain the reasoning behind. Dawson received a formal written reprimand for conduct unbecoming. Kane, despite his measured reaction during the actual crisis, found a note in his file regarding failure to maintain situational awareness during a perimeter breach, a black mark that would follow his next promotion review. Priya Voss was placed on a probationary watch list for her comments about wasted tent space. Burke received a formal censure that would sit in his record for the remainder of his enlistment. Dana didn't request any of it. She learned about the reprimand secondhand, the way she learned about most base gossip, without seeking it out and without particular satisfaction once she heard it. That evening, as she packed the last of her personal effects into a single duffel bag, Mason appeared at her tent flap with Dawson and 2 others trailing behind him, all of them wearing the specific uncomfortable posture of young men attempting an apology they'd never practiced before. "We wanted to say we were wrong," Mason said. "About all of it." Dana studied their faces for a long moment, the same flat, evaluating attention she'd have given a wound to assess its severity. "That's what matters," she said finally. "Not what you thought before. What you do now that you know better." She didn't lecture them further. She didn't need to. She simply zipped her duffel bag closed and let the moment settle into whatever shape it was going to take in each of their memories going forward. What none of them knew, what even Halvorsen hadn't mentioned, because the file that authorized it hadn't reached his desk until the following week, was that the briefing waiting for Dana 6 hours later concerned a situation considerably larger than a single reinstated command. A cell operating under an old alias her unit had chased across 3 continents 11 years earlier had resurfaced, using methods specific enough that only someone who'd studied their original operational patterns firsthand would recognize the signature buried in the new intelligence reports. Someone at the Pentagon had spent 6 months searching personnel databases for anyone who might still recognize that signature, and had found, buried under a medical corps assignment nobody had thought to flag, a name officially listed as deceased. Halvorsen had known that part when he saluted her in the tent doorway, though he hadn't said it, choosing instead to let the reinstatement paperwork carry the weight of the explanation rather than the specific horror of what she was actually being called back to look at. He'd spent 11 years believing the woman who ran Shadow Wolf had died, pulling 3 of his own men out of a collapsed position, and he'd carried that belief through countless briefings where her name came up in the past tense. A story told to justify new protocols, a cautionary tale about the cost of the work rather than a person who might still be standing somewhere, quietly bandaging blistered heels and telling frightened recruits to breathe slowly. Finding out otherwise, in the doorway of a medical tent at an ordinary training base, had cost him more composure than the salute let on. Dana Reyes drove off Camp Harrison base that evening in a plain government sedan, following the black SUV toward an airfield 2 hours east, her duffel bag on the seat beside her, the worn photograph still tucked in an inside jacket pocket where it had ridden for the better part of a decade. She didn't look back at the base in her rearview mirror. She'd learned a long time ago that looking back rarely changed anything about what was waiting ahead, and the version of herself that had spent 2 years quietly bandaging blistered heels and skinned knees would still be there, folded up somewhere she could find again, whenever this particular assignment finally let her put it back on. The recruits of Camp Harrison told the story for years afterward, embellishing details with each telling the way stories about a single, extraordinary afternoon always accumulate embellishment over time, until nobody quite remembered which parts had actually happened and which parts had simply felt true enough to keep. The core of it stayed consistent regardless. The quiet nurse nobody bothered to really look at had been carrying an entire life nobody had the clearance to ask about, and the day it finally surfaced, it surfaced in under 15 seconds, using nothing but a medical kit and a decade of training nobody at that base had ever been permitted to know existed. If this story is the kind that stays with you after it's over, send it to someone who needs to hear it today. Some of the most important people in any room are the ones everyone else already decided weren't worth a second look.